to the meeting, you can look in the chat for the link to Menti, and there's a code, and you can go to this page in your phone or in your computer in another window. And if you want, you can type in what your interests are in the theme of the event, biodiversity and human rights. It can be through your work or life or interests, something you want to learn more about. This is just a way to get to know the participants dropping in a bit better. So yeah, welcome all joining in. You can see the Menti questions in the chat. You will also see at the bottom of the page translation globe. So you can join the channel that you want to interpretation, and then you can join English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So we will take a few minutes and just let people drop in. And while we are waiting, you can go to Menti that you have in the chat, and you can use the code that you also see on the top of the screen, and let us know a little bit about your interest in the theme of this event. And if you find it difficult to use the Menti, of course, you can also write in the chat where you are calling in from, or greet people, and let us know your interest in this theme for today's discussions. And those joining in, you can find interpretation at the bottom of the page, and you can select English, Portuguese, or Spanish channels. You will soon get more instructions and information and a formal welcome, but we let you drop in, and you can go to Menti to share a bit about your interest in human rights and biodiversity. And we have almost 400 registered for this event, which is great. A lot of interest in the theme. We will see how many that will join in. So those who are joining in now, you can, for the first few minutes here, we will have this Mentimeter question open, where you can share either how you work with the themes or your interest in these themes of the event, so that we get to know a bit about who is in this meeting and what are your interests. And if you find it difficult to use the Menti, you can also place the same in the chat, so as you like. So now I think many have joined in. We will keep this Mentimeter up a little bit in the background, where you can put in your interest in biodiversity and human rights, the theme of the event here today. So that will roll. You have the links in the chat in the 3 languages, you have the code, and you can continue to type in your interests so that we see who is here. But then I think it's time to start. You can see also translation, interpretation at the bottom. You have the globe and you can select English, Spanish or Portuguese. We will have soon a more detailed instruction about this. So it's time to start this exchange. Warmly welcome. We have almost 400 people signed up for this event that show that this theme that we will discuss here today interests many, as we also can see by your answers here in this Mentimeter. And it's great to know that we are in a room with so much experience from different levels, regions and sectors. And we really look forward to hearing more from both the speakers here today and you as participants. And my name is Maria Öhlund, and I'm the project manager of the Focali Research Network and the Focali-SIANI Dialogue Forum, which is a new partnership initiative between the two networks for multi-stakeholder dialogues around interconnected forest, ecosystem, biodiversity, climate, livelihood, and rights issues. And what we do in this initiative really builds on the great experience, knowledge, and global networks among both Focali members and our partners that want to co-create activities as the event here today. That is co-organized together with Swedbio at Stockholm Resilience Center, Sida, the Tenure Facility, and GGBC at Gothenburg University. As you will see, this is really a team effort. Many have been part of the thinking behind this event. To mention a few, Pernilla Marmler at Swedbio and Maria Schultz at Sida. And Maria sent her greetings. She's unfortunately not able to join us today. And we have an active team of partners involved that have put together this amazing program and will lead you through this afternoon. We are in total 13 team members helping out on the stage and behind the scenes to make this event flow as well as possible. We might still face challenges with so many in this Zoom room, connection issues or a snowstorm as it can be here in Sweden. So before we hear more about the aim and outline of the event, I will turn to my colleague Magdalena Knöbel, who will be the chat moderator and now will run you through some advice on how to best use the translation and Zoom rules during the event and how you can get support if you face challenges with this. So welcome, Magdalena.
Thank you, Maria, for the introducing words. So I will guide you through a few slides here. The first one of them is the most important one, is the interpretation button. So during this event, we will have interpretation from English to Spanish and to Portuguese, but also vice versa. And to enable interpretation, you click on the interpretation button as shown on the picture here on this slide. It appears as a globe icon on the bottom right of your Zoom window. Choose your preferred language amongst English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And if you want to speak, please make sure that you're speaking in the same language as your channel. I speak in English, so I am in the English channel. And of course, if you feel comfortable with all three languages, you can decide to leave interpretation off, as long as you're not talking. Next slide, please. Some of you might be joining from their mobile phones. In that case, follow the instructions displayed on these images. You will find 3 dots on the bottom right of your Zoom app. Click on it and then find the globe icon representing language interpretation. Select your preferred language and then forget to click on Done to save your settings. Next slide, please. And here are a few further housekeeping rules. First, very important rule is to always have your microphone on mute unless you are urged to say anything. The organizing team will then unmute your button. For best experience, please select mute original audio once you've selected your preferred language. If you experience any problem, please reach out to _WW support in the chat. You will also use the chat for questions to the speakers. Always start your question with an @ and then the name of the speaker so we know who your question is directed to, and then write out your question. If the question is more of a general order, write @ and then all and then your question. We will pick up a few questions during the Q&A sessions, and you will have the opportunity to speak during the last part of the program. Next slide, please. Always remember to keep your microphones muted, please. We recommend you to use the speaker view that you can choose by clicking on the icon on the upper right part of your Zoom screen, as well as to rename yourself with your name you want us to call you by and your affiliation. You can do this by clicking on the 3 dots in the upper right corner of the video where you appear yourself. And you will find all this information in the chat in different languages. I wish you all a very fruitful event. I wish you a nice event again. Looking forward to nice discussions.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. Magdalena you will find her in the chat, and she will encourage you also to ask questions to the speakers. So yes, please remember to mute yourself, and the co-host will assist you if you're not muted. So we will let you know when it's time for this open platform where participants will be able to come in. So thank you so much for that. Then I want to invite Anna to the team. Anna Carolina Marciano, Program Officer at Swedbio, who's part of this planning. Why are we doing this? Can you share a bit of the aims? Why are we here today, Anna?
Thank you, Maria. Before talking a bit about the aim, it's important to say that biodiversity conservation and human rights are very present in the climate as well as the biodiversity global agenda. So a human rights based approach in the context of biodiversity conservation implies that biodiversity governance, policies, and management do not violate human rights, but also actively promote them. So for that to happen, actors working on policy and project implementation, program implementation, should seek ways to support and promote human rights in planning, implementing, and monitoring process. Therefore, when this group of co-conveners from different actors and networks with a focus on interconnections of nature and livelihoods started discussing, we came to one common point: the importance of reflecting on human rights, biodiversity, and sustainable use, highlighting the roles of indigenous peoples and local communities and environmental human rights defenders. But also the importance of having a broader discussion on how a human rights-based approach can be applied to different work, policy, practice, and also research. So this online exchange event aims to bridge human rights and biodiversity conservation knowledge, translating a human rights-based approach applied into development cooperation, biodiversity policy process, and into different local contexts across regions. So this online exchange attempts to share, exchange learnings, build capacity, and spark discussion so that different actors see the relevance of a human rights-based approach to their work, how it can be applied, how they can apply in their actions and in their daily activities. So we found as it's a good time to encourage the discussions and reflections to keep the momentum, as the COP26 for the climate finished a few weeks ago, and the Convention on Biological Diversity process is ongoing until it adopts its new post-2020 framework next year. So we have here a group of excellent, experienced panelists from across the globe that will share, exchange their knowledge, experience to facilitate reflections and understanding about the human rights-based approach and biodiversity. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was very clear. Yes, we are so grateful for all who have joined and will contribute to this exchange. And there will be time for interactions during the program. So with that, I will warmly welcome our my co-moderator, Stephen Woronecki, postdoc at Linköping University. So welcome, the floor is yours. You will let us know a bit about what we can expect and why we should stay until the end. So let us know.
Thank you, Maria, and hello everyone. It's a great privileged to help present our sessions and speakers for today. We will start with a session on the global policy context. Then we will hear about the role of Swedish international policy and development cooperation on these topics. After that, we will have a Mentimeter focused activity for everyone to get involved in. And after that, a short break. So after the break, we will hear perspectives from Indigenous peoples and environmental defenders. There will be plenty of opportunities for you to ask questions to the speakers. And then we will conclude with some reflection activities and turn the mics over to you with a chance to offer your perspectives on how we move forward on these critical issues. So do stick around to the end, as we have a rich schedule full of exceptional speakers and opportunities for you to contribute with recommendations to policy and programs. So without further ado then, we're going to move on to the first session. So I'm delighted to present the two speakers for the first session, who will help us understand the policy context, the key concerns, and why human rights-based approaches for biodiversity and people are needed. They are David Boyd and Soo-Young Hwang. David is legal officer with the UN Environment Programme and UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and Associate Professor of Law, Policy and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. Soo-Young is Legal Officer with the UN Environment Programme. We will start with David. David could unfortunately not join us live, but has kindly sent a video. So can we play that video now, please?
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Let me briefly address two reasons why human rights are relevant to the conversation about biodiversity. The first reason is universal. All human rights depend on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Think of pollinators and the right to food. Think of coastal mangroves as a defense against deadly storms, thus protecting the right to life. And think about healthy forests protecting us from zoonotic diseases. The second reason is that all too often conservation actions have violated human rights, evicting people from their homes and communities, criminalizing traditional lifestyles, even beating, raping, and murdering Indigenous peoples and members of local communities for merely trying to exercise and defend their rights. Surely we can all agree that in the 21st century, this is completely unacceptable. Yet these types of rights violations are ongoing in the creation and management of protected areas in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and beyond. I recently published a report on rights-based approaches to conserving, protecting, and restoring biodiversity with the goal of influencing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. My brief had three main conclusions. Number one, human rights-based approaches must be highlighted and incorporated throughout the global biodiversity framework. Based on human rights law, this is an obligation, not an option. Human rights should be front and center in legislation and national biodiversity strategy and action plans. This includes all processes to designate new protected areas and expand existing areas, both on land and water, to meet the 30% by 2030 target. This includes planning, management, and enforcement. And this also includes, critically, the financing of conservation actions. Over the course of the next decade, hundreds of billions of dollars will be invested in biodiversity conservation and nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. It's critical that these investments be carefully screened to ensure that they respect, protect, fulfill, and promote human rights. The second key point is that the rights of Indigenous peoples and other rural rights holders have to be prioritized. By this, I'm referring not only to free, prior, and informed consent, but more broadly to the title, rights, and governance responsibilities of Indigenous peoples and other rural rights holders. These rights must be incorporated in law, implemented, and respected. And the third key point is that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment should be incorporated in the framework, and measurable targets related to its implementation should be included. We recently saw the historic recognition by the UN Human Rights Council of everyone's right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And the unique aspect of this, alone among human rights, is that it can be used to protect both human health and ecosystem health. Recognizing the right to a healthy environment empowers everyone, including children, youth, and women, to engage in nature conservation. Now, UN resolutions are not legally binding, but they are catalysts for change. After the 2010 resolutions on the rights to water and sanitation, a number of countries, including Costa Rica, Fiji, Mexico, Slovenia, and Tunisia, added the right to water to their constitutions, their highest and strongest laws. Other nations, from Colombia to France, added this right to legislation. And most importantly, nations accelerated efforts to fulfill the right to water. Mexico has extended clean drinking water to more than 1,000 rural communities. Slovenia has prioritized access to drinking water for Roma communities living in informal settlements. And Canada has worked with Indigenous communities to bring safe drinking water to more than 115 communities that in some cases had gone for decades without. The bottom line is that we know rights-based approaches to conservation work. Lands where Indigenous peoples' title and rights are recognized are high in biodiversity, high in forest protection, and high in carbon storage. In Namibia, community conservation areas have led to larger wildlife populations, economic benefits, and increased human well-being. A marine protected area near Cabo Pulmo in Mexico, which was designated at the request of the local community, has helped rebuild fish populations and generated a thriving tourism sector. Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada and Australia are protecting biodiversity, reviving cultures, and generating economic benefits for Indigenous peoples. So, friends and colleagues, it's absolutely imperative that the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework put human rights at the heart of conservation. And as I said earlier, this is an obligation, not an option for governments. Thank you very much, and please keep up the great work.
So we thank David for sending that insightful contribution to the program and also for the important work he has been doing on this topic. Now it is time for us to hear from Soo-Young Hwang. So Alice, can you share the PowerPoint, please? And Soo-Young, I give the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. And it's really great to have so many participants in this meeting. And I'm really honored to be here. So I am Soo-Young Hwang. I'm with the UN Environment Program. And I work on the intersection between human rights and the environment. And I will be introducing a few new developments that's happening in the human rights field and how that can be integrated to the the Global Biodiversity Framework and also other biodiversity field. So I'll be, David Boyd has said a lot of great stuff. So I'll be actually adding to what he's also said about the council resolution and other issues. Next slide, please. So let me start with this historical resolution on the recognition of the right to healthy environment. So the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on the 8th of October this year, about just less than 2 months ago. They adopted this resolution recognizing the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And that's the first recognition of the right at the global level. And it was supported by so many different parts of society, so states and CSOs, and also indigenous peoples organizations, and also business sectors, as well as the UN entities as well. And the resolution was voted, but then out of 47 members of the Human Rights Council, 43 states voted in favor and 4 abstained, but there was no one opposing it. And on top of that, we had 78 co-sponsors of the resolution as well. So you can see how that's the resolution had a really good support from member states as well. And the contents of the resolution, so it's only a 2.5 pages. It's a very short resolution, but it contains recognize the relationship between human rights and the ecosystems and the biodiversity, and also recognize the implementation of MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, how important that is to realize the right of the environment and other human rights. And also it refers to the future generations as well as environmental human rights defenders. And the impacts of the resolution, it's only been 2 months, but we can see that is already happening. As David said, it's not legally binding, but it is being a catalyst in many different ways. So it is it's been referred in many political discussions, including the IPLCs Convention, the meetings of parties of the IPLCs Convention on access to information, participation, and justice. And they also decided to establish something called the Rapid Response Mechanism for Environmental Defenders. So the parties of the IPLCs Convention will appoint a special rapporteur working on environmental defenders sometime next year. So it's a lot of things are happening with and biodiversity in the CBD negotiations. I learned that some states are actually talking about the integrating this resolution into the global biodiversity framework, but also and how we can other areas such as UNEA, UN Environment Assembly, and the political declarations related to that can integrate this resolution. And some other next slide, please. So very briefly, some other developments is the legal development as a means of implementation. In fact, because we talk about this policy development and legal development, but we talk about also like the implementation, how this is going to be implemented. So those I will introduce two very encouraging updates. So one is the Committee on the Rights of the Child. It's a committee that oversees and monitors the progress made under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. They made very encouraging decision. So one is they decided to do a general comment on the environment with a focus on climate change, which relates to also the biodiversity and also and sorry, I'm just looking at the questions coming up. Sorry, so the climate change, biodiversity, also indigenous child. So it's not just any child, but all children, but also like with the different needs of the children, and it depends on the situation they're in. So there'll be it will be the first, once it's done, it will be the first general comment of any human rights treaty bodies that is dedicated to the environmental issues. So as far as I know, that's it's scheduled to be published in 2023. So this will really help guide states and to monitor to child rights in relation to biodiversity and environment and the climate change issues, and also be a benchmark where how they can improve and also realize their children's rights in this regard. And another encouraging development is the child and youth petition to the committee. So as you can see in the photo, there were 16 children, there are like over 10 children coming from like many different countries, and submitting a complaint to the committee about their rights violation because of climate change and environmental issues. So this is another mechanism that individuals, it has quite a bit of legal issues that that petitioners will have to go through, but it's a very useful mechanism to claim their rights violation because of the climate and the environmental issues, including biodiversity. That petition did not go through; it became inadmissible because the committee found that the petitioners did not exhaust domestic remedies. But regardless, this is a really good decision. They've said the countries may have obligation to protect, or may have obligation to protect rights of the children from transboundary environmental impacts. So
1 minute.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is quite an interesting and also encouraging decision of the committee. Next slide, please. And another means of implementation, the national human rights institutions, as there are about 120 countries have the national human rights, independent national human rights institutions, and they're working more and more on environmental issues. And they're very close, working on the ground level, at the national level, also the global level, for protecting the environment and biodiversity and the rights of present and future generations. So this is also very encouraging the development coming from the national institutions, that they committed themselves to do more in this regard. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just want to point to introduce some reflections on about the possible next steps. So one, as I mentioned, integration of the Human Rights Council resolution, but I should have actually said the resolutions, because there are 2 more resolutions that is focused on human rights and biodiversity coming from the Human Rights Council. And why do we need to integrate this is to increase the policy coherence. Is one government, so you cannot have a Minister of Environment and Minister of Justice or Minister of Foreign Affairs doing different things. So it makes sense to actually like come together and then implement this resolution and relevant human rights and environmental laws. And also it's their legal obligation, as David Boyd said, because human rights law is very clear, but you know, states will have to protect human rights from environmental degradation. And practical benefits is it will really help the biodiverse actions be more sustainable when you guarantee the rights of the rights to participation, and also everybody to be informed about this and so on. And the next point I just wanted to mention is, as David also mentioned, the conservation funding that's going to be expect. We're talking quite a lot about mobilization of funds, but we're not actually talking about how the funds are going to be used. So I think it was really the critical time that we start talking about the human rights requirements, how these funds are going to be used in the manner that respect human rights. And implementation through knowledge exchange. This is a really good example of integrating biodiversity, environmental issues, and human rights, because we have a lot to learn from each other, and not always that we talk from to each other, such as we have states working in Geneva for Human Rights Council and states working in Nairobi for environmental issues, but always they are not actually talking. So it's that these meetings like this, or talking actually with different constituencies, I think this is a good way forward in integrating these 2 currently a little bit separated areas. So that is it from me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Soo-Young. That was fascinating and really informative, and sets us up really well for the rest of the session today. So now we have time for 1 or 2 questions, and I hand over to my colleague, Anna.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you, Soo-Young, for a great presentation. So we have 2 questions, and people can continue sending, and maybe we will have time. But I think the first question here is, you mentioned the global biodiversity framework. So could you like help us to understand what is the process for linking and integrating the Human Rights Council resolution to the global biodiversity framework, like who, when, and none? So, and yeah, how would be in practice, and how so the resolution could contribute?
Okay, thanks so much for the question. I have to be very clear, I'm not a biodiversity expert, so I could maybe others could also help out. But to my best knowledge, actually we have a good entry point, January next year, when the CBD parties will have various meetings in Geneva. and also the open-ended working group, and they'll be discussing this draft global biodiversity framework. So that will be a good entry point, and that's an opportunity like presented before us, and who I think all of us, but at the same time is fundamentally intergovernmental process. So states will be discussing and negotiating the text, but it doesn't prevent CSOs or individuals to actually really increase to help states track their like policies. So having meetings with them, also talking to them about this is, you know, this is coming from the CSOs and also indigenous peoples as a rights holder, that we have a right actually to tell you, you know, what we want and how I would like my government to actually set up the policies and so on. So I would say everyone, but also working with states is really, really a key to make any tangible changes in the framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Soo-Young. I think it's connected a little bit with this question also, because you said like it's related to the state. And then there's a very interesting question that it says like, while like we recognize that these are not binding, so but what are the developments that have been made like to create an independent accountability or due diligence mechanism? Thank you.
Yeah, so international law actually works in a very different way from national law, I would say. So it's not binding, it's not legally binding. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any weight. So we've seen a lot of examples of how human rights are being implemented, although it's not legally binding sometimes. There's one example is the UPR process of the Human Rights Council. It's called Universal Periodic Review. It's not legally binding. It's purely a review process, but all countries are reviewed by their peers. And this states actually take this very seriously. So this, so the resolutions or the biodiversity framework, not legally binding, but as long as you have good mechanism and also the channels and also the implementation mechanism and the accountability compliance mechanism, I think it will actually work. And we've seen that actually working in different areas. So not sure if I actually answered your question.
No, yes. And we have like a third question here, and I will try to add a little bit. So as you said, you've been working with the intersection between human rights and the environment, and we see a lot of like human rights organization working on one side and conservation and environmental organizations working in the other side. So I think you have a nice understanding of how interconnect. So then we have this question that it's related to donors as well. Like donors should be using more human rights requirements and human rights approach. How, based on your experience, how do you feel like how can this be also controlled effectively and also like enforced from people, from the ground, from the rights holders? Like how to encourage like emerging donors who are currently working not that much with the human rights approach, but trying to engage and have the framework. And how can we encourage this emerging donor to really implement programs with the human rights-based approach, with the human rights aspect?
So that's a very good question. I think it may actually require like very long answer, but there's an increasing development in everywhere that donors or the businesses, even the EU, for instance, they are actually developing a policy guideline on due diligence, which actually says that we're going to commit ourselves to, all businesses of the EU will commit ourselves to like not to make sure that we don't violate human rights, and also like we don't harass people or the environmental defenders. So there's a lot of voluntary guidelines coming up from the donors or the implementers side. So for biodiversity, so it's not to create something new, but it will be like when there's a funding agreement or there's any funding issues, it is just that should just comply with the existing human rights law and the existing human rights principles. So for that, it's just really, as I mentioned, I think knowledge exchange and talking with each other, because in government, there's people working on biodiversity only and people working on human rights. But also if they just talk to each other, and also like if we start breaking the silos and work together, that may happen because we are not talking about something new. Right? We're just actually talking about something that we already have. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, Stefan? Maria?
No.
I think we have to finish now,
Okay.
right? Unfortunately. So thank you, Anna, and thank you so much, Soo-Young. And we also thank David for his contribution. And thanks also to your really fantastic questions. So I know there was a few more that we didn't have the chance to touch on now. So either Soo-Young, you can write in the chat if you feel like it. Otherwise, we can come back to them later. And now I'm going to hand over to Maria for the next session. So thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much all, and yes, please continue to discuss in the chat. There might of course be some language challenges there, but we will get to a platform by the end where some of the issues can be raised again. So we will now go into a session with focus on the role of Swedish international policy and development cooperation at different levels. And as you can see in the program and in the bios on the web page, the State Secretary to the Swedish Minister for International Development Cooperation was supposed to have joined us here. But however, as you might have heard, we have a new government in Sweden since yesterday, and Janine Alm Eriksson, the former State Secretary, has thus left her role and cannot join us today. We will instead focus on the second speaker in this pair from Sida, Anna Bolin, and after this there will be a Q&A, so please continue to post the questions in the chat during her presentation. So I warmly welcome Anna Bolin, Program Manager, Biodiversity and Natural Resources at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, Sida. And you joined Sida, I think this summer, coming from IID, with rich experience in this field. The floor is yours. Welcome. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that warm welcome. Okay, so I think we'll go straight into it. So we will look at how human rights-based approach is important to Sida and Swedish Development Cooperation. Next slide, please. So according to the latest World Bank Development Report, we're seeing poverty, extreme poverty increasing for the first time in 20 years. This is, of course, largely triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, but nonetheless, the times are quite extreme. At the same time, we see accelerating climate change, human rights and democratic backsliding, as well as an unprecedented scale of biodiversity loss. So in an effort to respond to these big challenges, in October 2020, the government of Sweden issued 2 specific assignments. One instructs Sida to strengthen and deepen the work related to biodiversity and ecosystems throughout its operations. And the other gives the same instruction in regards to democracy and human rights. In practice, this means that these 2 areas are given increased priority, both in policy, engagement, in dialogue with partners, but also in mobilizing additional financing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So how are these principles applied in Swedish development cooperation in practice? So Sida has applied a human rights-based approach to development cooperation since at least 2003, when it was first established in Swedish policy. And this was as a result of the UN Common Understanding of a Human Rights-Based Approach to Development Cooperation and Programming. It is 1 out of 5 perspectives that Sida uses to guide its work, where human rights are intertwined with the perspectives of people living in poverty, gender equality, environment and climate, and conflict. And this is applied across 4 key dimensions, like you can see in the diagram here to the left. And at the heart of this is an understanding that this is about empowerment. A key point of departure is that people living in poverty are identified as rights holders with legal entitlements and agency to hold duty bearers to account to comply with human rights commitments. Another point of departure is that well-functioning ecosystems and a stable climate are a prerequisite for complying with human rights and for a sustainable peace. And the other way around, healthy ecosystems and a safe climate are human rights in itself. And so working in this holistic way helps us understand the links and the conditions that create sustainable development, but also puts demands on us to work more integrated within the organizations, to not work in silos and build on each other's expertise. Next slide, please. So here we see a little bit of the workflow established to implement these 2 government assignments. This process is being led by Maria Schultz, that was already mentioned, I believe, by Maria, and Birgitta Weber. Both are senior specialists and advisors in the areas of biodiversity and human rights within Sida. One thing that we can say already is that biodiversity was perhaps the area that was needing a bit more of a push initially. But we can say that for now, according to the baseline we've been able to establish, is that this is becoming increasingly visible in the Swedish government priorities. It is included in nearly half of the present government strategies, and since 2010, financing for biodiversity has tripled. This level of ambition is expected to increase from 2022 and beyond when a new strategy development process is planned. Next slide, please. So what does supporting a human rights-based approach look like for Sida at different levels of policy and practice? So of course, a very important part of this is to working with cooperation partners. And so, for example, Sida is supporting organizations such as the Tenure Facility, one of the co-organizers today, who channels financing and technical assistance directly to Indigenous peoples and local community organizations so that they can secure the tenure rights that they depend on for safe livelihoods and human rights. Many of these communities are also at the front line of different types of power struggles, which sometimes leads to conflict. And so there is also a need to protect the leaders and individuals who stand at the front line of these struggles. Global Witness 2020 figures report more than 200 lethal attacks on environmental defenders in 2020 alone. So there's a need to support and protect these individuals too. Here, Sida is supporting organizations such as Earth Rights International, and they work at the root causes of attacks on defenders to protect their rights and the civic space. Finally, Sida also works with different conservation NGOs to support them in institutionalizing a human rights-based approach within their organizations, as well as together with rights holders and duty bearers. This is another very important area of work within Sida. Next slide, please. At an international policy level, Sida has historically been an active promoter of a human rights-based approach within this.
One minute.
Okay, within the CBD process. And here I wanted to also bring out a very successful example and result from 2010. It started with Swedbio, who is also one of the co-organizing partners here today. So the 2010 negotiations came to a deadlock. And here Swedbio, together with the government of Sweden and other partners, the CBD secretariat, managed to organize a dialogue process in order to ensure that partners could speak to each other, understand each other. What were the opportunities? What were the challenges? At the end, a set of safeguards were developed that were later also adopted in the COP12 in 2014. So that's just a little bit of a positive result along the way. Next slide, please. And I should also mention that Claudia Ituarte-Lima, who is here today, was part of that process. In terms of priorities and challenges ahead, so Sida will continue to deepen the work and scale up contributions that promotes a human rights-based approach to biodiversity conservation and livelihoods, including working with contribution partners, but also the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Another priority is to continue to look at these safeguards and different opportunities as well as challenges for biodiversity financial mechanisms. At the same time, challenges remains in terms of the narrowing of the civic space. And so whilst we are scaling up protection of biodiversity within these different processes, there need to be a simultaneous move towards ensuring that this happens in equal partnerships with local rights holders who can also secure their rights to tenure and livelihoods. So these are some of the issues that Sida continues to keep an eye on and monitor. And I would like to end there.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this rich insight to how Sida is taking on board these intertwined areas in your work at different levels, from global to the work we have your partners of many of here today. So we will look at some. If there are some questions, you can post them in the chat. I will start asking a question. You mentioned the interconnectedness of these themes and the needed intertwining of human rights-based approach, biodiversity and sustainable livelihoods, and that this also challenge Sida internally to not work in silos. I know that you quite recently joined Sida, but perhaps you can already share a bit, very short, on some experience on how Sida is trying to internally break those silos and collaborate around these interlinked themes, the quick version, if you have any, if you've seen any, or if there's aims to collaborate more ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely. There is, on the one hand, a lot of education happening across different departments, different focus areas. There is a specific instruction also to encourage more collaboration across different priority areas to break those silos. So that's a very conscious move to do that. Having these different 5 different dimensions that we focus on also helps us to ensure, because we monitor them. So if you can say that, right, you're working a lot on biodiversity here, but you're not at all integrating peace and conflict, then we know that we need to work more with peace and conflict in order to make sure that we have a balanced approach and that we capture this 5 dimensions that we see as being key to achieving sustainable development, but also reducing poverty in a sustainable way.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I will turn to Jessica. I think there has been some activities in the chat. If you would like to pick up a first question from the chat to Anna.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much, Anna, for your intervention. And there has been a couple of questions. So the first question for you is, does Sida also supports individuals directly or only via organizations? And are there any names of these organizations, or are individuals that can get support directly from Sida, or how does it work?
Sida supports organizations, not individuals, as a first answer. This happens either through global cooperation partners, so that is partners that are working at a global scale, or partners that are working at a national level through our bilateral agreements, for example. We work with a range of cooperation partners. Some of them, I mentioned Tenure Facility that channels funds directly to organizations, Indigenous peoples and local community organizations. We have another similar partner that does that with the Forest and Farm Facility. But then also we work with multilaterals and so on, and we work with civil society organizations. So it's really diverse, and is a purposeful strategy to have simultaneously collaboration across these different types of partnerships, as well as policy engagement processes, in order to have a more effective transformational approach rather than fragmented and working in certain silos.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a second question. There has been some comments on the chat as well, and it relates to food security and different livelihoods offered for different communities. And do you think that the human right-based approach can entangle and integrate these kind of directions in terms of food security, and how can that be done?
Yes, I think so. Access to food, nutritious food, I believe, is a human right in itself. And of course, yes, I think the human rights-based approach, as per instruction we have from the Swedish government, should be integrated across all of our work. And so the intention and the purpose of that is that it has an application throughout, and that is a way to do that.
Great. There's other questions. Then what can be done to make it easier for organizations on the ground to receive more direct forms of funding for them to implement their own right-based approaches rather than the money that goes through the global north? And this is, I guess, a real urgency, as some of the forest pledges, at least from the COP26, came along. So
yeah. So the way that we work with partners at the moment who are working directly with organizations to receive direct funds. So they're like a middleman in terms of a financial facility to channel funds through. And their role essentially is to help with that specific part. So how can we work with these organizations, who in turn work with these organizations to strengthen their capacity to receive funds directly? Often this is a gradual process, and the aim is to make it possible for those organizations to be eligible for funding more directly from a more wide range of actors.
Great. Do we have time for more questions, or that's it, Maria?
I think since we are running a little bit behind, I would encourage Anna, if you could answer some of the questions in the chat, if you can stay and continue discussing. And one final question that I posed, you can also maybe answer that in just two points. If you can give, the challenges are so urgent, could you say something on, you said that these are priority areas, but what is Sida doing to really scale this up, this support? And you can mention just briefly two points, and then you can go to answer other questions in the chat as well.
2 points. So
yeah,
first
and you can
point,
continue in the chat, but
no problem. So first one, there's these two instructions. One instruction is to integrate biodiversity across all development cooperation work that we have by 2023, and a similar instruction for human rights and democracy by 2022. That means scaling up our efforts concretely throughout the support that Sida does, throughout the policy engagements that it gets involved with. Secondly, in terms of financing, Sida has, of course, its own means through the Swedish government that supports this financing. It has been increasing in terms of biodiversity, at least since 2010. But we also have guarantee instruments that we use to leverage financing from other sources. So this is another way that Sida can scale up financing being available at a country level, at a global level.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that quick answer. And do feel free to answer some more questions in the chat. So we will continue. We will have a quick sort of Mentimeter question up, while you can also stretch your legs for 3 minutes before we will go into the next session. So Alice will put up the Mentimeter, and you will find the instructions and the code in the chat. So now we are starting to dig into these issues a bit more, and we are interested to know what you think are the main barriers for a human rights-based approach to be used more in conservation policy and practice. What are some of the main barriers? So you can chip in here in the Mentimeter, and you can of course continue to discuss this later. So let's all just take, we can be back in, you can look at this when you have time. It will also be open after when we start the next session, so you can continue to fill in then. And let's be back in about 4 minutes to start. And then I will hand over to Stephen to start a few minutes past then. So thank you so much for sharing some of the barriers that you see. You can share in English, Spanish, Portuguese. We can translate later in the team. And all what you provide input on in these interactions, we will discuss it by the very end, but we are using also this event to collect your insights, and also later in the open platform recommendations for policy and programs on ways forward. So this will be used, and we will compile and share after the event as well. So I will hand over to Stephen. When you are ready, you can kick off the next session. Sorry for the delay there. We will try to also keep track on time.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back, and I hope you're feeling refreshed. So now we turn to some of the most important issues and voices of our program. In this session, we're going to be hearing from Indigenous peoples and environmental defenders on these critical topics. Again, it's worth recognizing just how important these groups are for safeguarding biodiversity, which has always been known, of course, by these groups. And that realization is also strongly backed by science. We will hear what messages and lessons for policy and practice agencies these actors have, drawing from their experiences on the front lines of safeguarding biodiversity and livelihoods. And we'll hear about the risks for environmental and human rights defenders if Indigenous peoples and local communities' participation, rights, and tenure is not sufficiently included in policy and implementation of conservation. So this session is going to be in 3 parts. First, we are going to hear a short video from Joan Carling. Then we will hear short presentations from our first 2 speakers, after which is your opportunity to ask questions to them both. And then we will do the same for our second pair of speakers, who will focus on environment and human rights defenders more specifically. So to start off with, we have a video from Joan Carling. Joan is Global Director of Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera in the Philippines. So can we play Joan's video, please? Thank you.
Good day to everyone. Thank you for having me take part in this important meeting on human rights-based approach to biodiversity and livelihoods. Biodiversity conservation is very much part of Indigenous people's identity, ways of life, culture, knowledge, and more importantly, our reciprocal relations with nature. In this sense, we are stewards of nature and at the same time, environment defenders. In fact, if we look at the data on biodiversity conservation in the world, 60 to 80% are in indigenous territories. However, only 10% of our land and resources are legally recognized. We are thereby facing serious threats to the remaining biodiversity that we are protecting. And these threats are in 2 dimensions mainly. One is the threat from the regard to our lands and resources as source of profit and wealth for the very few. And they do this by expropriating our lands to agribusiness, to mining, and other destructive projects. And these projects are resulting to our displacements, the destruction of our livelihoods, the abuse of women. And when we protest to defend our lands and resources, we are being criminalized for not having the legal right to our lands. We are being killed. We are tortured and arrested and subjected to other forms of repression. The other dimension also of the challenge that we face is the fortress conservation, which separates us from our natural environment that is targeted for conservation, which is a skewed concept because we are already conserving it and they want to take us away and somebody else will do it. And in this regard, we are again displaced. We are not provided access to our sustainable livelihoods. In fact, we are being criminalized again if we do our traditional livelihoods. So we face the same kind of persistent human rights violations, especially to the exercise of our collective rights. So these challenges that we face, particularly in relation to the expropriation of our lands and resources and forest conservation, should stop. And thereby, we appeal to decision makers, especially coming from governments and the private sector, to first ensure that we have legal rights over our lands, territories, and resources, and these are secured so that we are able to continue the conservation of biodiversity. We also need measures to protect environment defenders, our leaders, and communities as we exercise our rights, as we practice our sustainable livelihoods, for example. And third, we need to have access to remedy when we are being displaced from our lands, because it is important that there is accountability when biodiversity is being destroyed, and that the destroyers, coming from those with vested interest, are clearly held accountable, and by ensuring the recognition of our rights and the respect for our rights, we are extending our hands to form partnerships with states, with the private sector, in the context, again, emphasizing the context of the respect and protection of our rights, that will also enable us to contribute the most in biodiversity conservation. And in the spirit of partnership and a human rights-based approach to biodiversity, we can work together in our common aspiration to address climate change and to pursue sustainable development for all. I just want to state again that Indigenous peoples are providing the solutions to climate change and to achieve sustainable development with our knowledge and contributions to biodiversity conservation, to sustainable management of resources. And we should be regarded as partners because we are willing and already doing this role, and we hope we can work together in this common aspiration. Thank you.
So we thank Joan so much for contributing with that video, which was a powerful testimony to what is at stake, and also provides so many pathways forward, right? We know how active Joan is in this area, and we recognize the critical and important work she is doing to raise these issues, especially during this critical period. So now we move to our first pair of speakers. It's a great privilege to present José Gualinga and Matilda Månsson. José is one of the leaders of the native people of Sarayaku, an indigenous Kichwa group in Ecuador's southern Amazon. Matilda Månsson is legal advisor in international affairs at the Sámi Parliament in Sweden. So José will begin, and then after that I will ask Matilda to talk, and then we will have questions to you both. So to the audience, please don't hesitate to write your questions in the chat in whichever of the 3 languages you feel most comfortable. José, we are so grateful that you could join us today, and I give the floor over to you. So when you're ready, thank you.
Un saludo a todos.
Greetings to everyone from Sarayaku. I'm in the heart of the Amazon forest. I'm speaking to you from the territory. Thank you for this opportunity. Sarayaku, we are a people who had been fighting in a peaceful way, with arguments, with legal reasons, with our knowledge and wisdom to defend the right to the land, the right to life, the right to be a people with identity and culture. And also, we've been fighting to guarantee the future generations, not only of the inhabitants of our people of Sarayaku, but also of all the Ecuadorians and of all the humankind. We have a territory of 135,000 hectares preserved. Almost 95% of this territory is a virgin territory, which means without any distraction, and we live 1,400 people living here. We are 7 communities with a government council with 25 members, and it is up to us to do the sustainable management of this territory. I would like to start saying that when we preserve our territory, we are already having or making a very important contribution to the fight against climate change. This is key because from our territory, we've always shared the global solutions, and this is our project, our life project. Now, as the first peoples, we also face some public policies which are the invisible way of creeping up into our land and evicting us and destroying the territories and the human rights to the indigenous peoples. Public policies are a way of going forward and to give more openness to policies of extractivist industries like the expansion of the oil and gas exploitation, the wood exploitation, the expansion of agricultural frontiers, and also the building of roads, which are really and truly the major threats to our territories. And these public policies from the local and decentralized governments and also from the central governments, together with the support from multilateral organizations of the large corporations of the world, which are at the top of these policies, they do affect negatively the rights of the indigenous peoples. When we face these sort of legal situations, we've also put forward some important proposals. Like, for example, we have taken this case to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights because of these rights. Our rights had been violated, and these rights, which had been completely unknown and disregarded by the jurisdiction and the Ecuadorian laws, in 2012, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights sentenced the state of Ecuador as the perpetrator to the rights of the life, to the rights to life of the Sarayaku's people. It is important to mention the ruling of the court, which demands the free, previous, and informed consent according to the international standards. So not only to be a consultation process, but also that this should be a mechanism for us to have this right to consent, because here what it is at stake is the life, is our life. So we're working towards having this respect being upheld, not only for a project, but to be a duty, an obligation, this consent. On the other hand, we don't only do these claimings and fighting in the defensive way, but also we put forward important proposals. Within the territory, we have different actions, very, very important actions that we develop here to have this right to manage in a sustainable way our land, our territory. Like, for example, we have the proposal of a the good living proposal, which has very important dimensions within the planning, as we call the living or the life plans, as we call it. And we also have a second proposal, which is the living forest. It's Caso Sasha in our language. It means living forest. According to the constitution of the country of Ecuador, which acknowledges the rights to nature, we had also worked for the life territories, these living forests of the first peoples, that they can also be acknowledged and declared legally as a territory, as a right bearer, as a conscious and a living being. This is our idea. We think of a forest as a living forest. For us, it is a living being. And this comes from a millennial, historic, and traditional wisdom and knowledge. Our people, they had thought about that with this approach that everything is living being, the lagoons, the lakes, the mountains, the birds, everything, the forest, everything which surrounds us is a living being. So we have an intertwined relationship with which we are connected. So this proposal comes from this idea, from this knowledge, and we are developing it now as a bill of
1 minute.
life and governance.
Importantísimo para
So
la
it is very important for the governance of the territories. We're talking about the approach of the territory governance with our autonomy and with our own rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jose, for your contribution. It's an exceptional opportunity for us to listen to you and learn from you, and to learn what it means to be a climate and biodiversity leader, despite the challenges that you and your community faces. So please be writing your questions to Jose in the chat in whichever language you feel comfortable, and we will translate them. Before we move to those questions, we're going to first hear from Matilda Månsson.
Thank you. Good day to everyone, and thank you for this invitation. So to just start off, I would just give you a brief introduction. And the Sámi are the indigenous people in Sápmi, which covers part of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. And the Sámi parliament in Sweden was established through the Sámi Parliament Act in '93, and this is the popularly elected representative body of the Sámi people in Sweden. There are also parliaments in Norway and Finland. And the Sámi parliament in Sweden, or the Sametinget in northern Sámi, also functions as a government agency on Sámi issues, with the overall task to promote and strengthen Sámi culture, which, as we've heard here, involves issues on languages, on livelihoods, and so on. And our work is to also includes advocating, promoting, and protecting Sámi rights and interests in order to ensure that Sámi economic, social, and cultural development is maintained. And that's also, I think, the question of today. What are the key roles of indigenous peoples, local communities, and environmental human rights defenders in tackling biodiversity loss? And I would rather address not having a key role, but rather plural, like there are several roles. And I just wanted to name a few and give examples from a Sámi context on how these different roles can be expressed and intertwined. So one of the roles are as knowledge holders, where indigenous peoples' worldviews and values, understanding of sustainability and the importance of a holistic approach is addressed. And in the Sámi context, we use the word arbetjehtu, Sámi knowledge, and that includes heritage and traditions, customs and way of life. And the word arbi means heritage, and jehtu means knowledge or even knowing. So it's a way of heriting knowledge. And it is a collective knowledge that is transmitted between generations and through the Sámi languages and through interacting with nature and practicing traditional livelihoods. And one other aspect of this is arbemahtu, which are the skills on actually how to use this knowledge in practice. So we use these two words to understand and capture the relationship between nature and human beings, and also to understand that sustainability means to not take more than you need and to always give something back. And this is shown in one of the policies that we have, which is called the Elimbiras, which is a program on our living environment, which sets out the fundament of all our work, and that there is this balance of development to ensure a high quality of life without causing negative impacts on nature and environment. And one of the other roles I want to mention that was mentioned by Joan Carling, and as stewards of nature. And like other indigenous peoples, the Sámi have a special relation to traditional lands, and this is of importance to collective physical, spiritual, social, and cultural well-being and survival. And this is taking place through the different livelihoods, practicing traditional occupations, hunting, gathering, and reindeer herding, and so on, fishing. And this is important in maintaining ecosystem services and ensuring food security. And the third role are as rights holders, according to international conventions. And we heard about the resolution that David Boyd and Soo-Young Hwang mentioned on the interlinkages on how environment and nature is necessary to the fulfillment of human rights, but also the other way around, how recognition and respect for human rights is crucial for the protection of nature. And I just wanted to give a few examples. Then, of course, there are risks when not recognizing this, that gives an inadequate decision, unsustainable management, violation of rights, and it can cause distrust and conflicts, loss of languages and important knowledge, and of course, loss of health and well-being. So I just want to give some examples on how it's important to include indigenous peoples when determining priorities, when designing policies, and in the implementation and management of nature. So a few of the examples that we have been working on is, of course, what some of you might have heard of, an act on consultation, which is a legislative duty for government and authorities to consult Sámi on matters affecting them. But also we have something called reindeer management plans, which are a tool for land use and planning in environmental permitting process, which are incorporating the traditional knowledge from Sámi reindeer herding, and talks about how the land is being used on the grazing grounds, migration routes, and so on. And this is then shown how then land can be used in different ways. And this is then combining knowledge from traditional reindeer herding, but also incorporating this into land use planning. We also had a cooperation with the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, where guidelines were developed on how government agencies and local governments should conduct consultations and ensure effective participation of Sámi and Sámi reindeer herding communities when establishing nature reserves. So there are also a lot of these examples that I think could be helpful, and also we are now engaged in the work of the CBD that was mentioned, and the development of a new global biodiversity framework. And the Sámi Parliament is a part of the Swedish delegation. We're also focal point for the articles 8J and 10C of the convention that addresses
indigenous people's rights, traditional knowledge, and customer sustainable use. Thank you very much. Kiitos.
Thank you very much, Matilda. That was so insightful, and we're really grateful to you sharing those examples and experiences about your work. So now I will hand over to Torsten, who's going to ask questions to you both. So if you're there, José, great. Thank you, Torsten.
Yes, dear José, Matilda, thank you very much for your presentations. There's been a few questions that came in through the chat. And I think you talked a lot about the importance of recognizing different types of knowledge and different types of actually interacting with the environment, which is sometimes something that I think science and maybe policymakers are having a struggle to understand and actually to put themselves in, because we see these things as quite from a very different perspective. And there is definitely a need to work much more respecting different types of knowledges and different types of actual relating to the environment and to resources. I'm going to pick up a few questions here that came from the chat. And the first one that was for José is about whether the process of the living forest proposal, how it has been received by the national government of Ecuador, because you mentioned that the Ecuadorian government has certain elements in the constitution that recognizes the rights of nature, recognizes this when viviet concept. But in practice, how is it actually been received, and how actually does it affect the actions and the policies taken by the government?
Well, the Constitution of Ecuador acknowledges the rights to nature, but in reality, it is just something in paper. If we don't demand the enforcement of this Constitution, basically, it is not going to be respected. I mean, this constitutional right is not being respected. That is why we have done, first of all, a public statement at the national, international level, with the living forest. This is our proposal, Causa Sasha. And now we're working on a proposal, on a platform rather. It is a legal platform to put forward a living forest territory governance platform. And this will allow us to exercise in our lands the right to self-govern as in a plurinational state, as it is acknowledged by the Ecuadorian constitution. And obviously, for the state, for the authorities, for the government, for the interest, this proposal is a threat, because it's basically trying to shield. That's what we're trying to do, to shield, to guarantee the conservation of biodiversity. But that's what we want, to exercise the governance. And we're looking for dialogue fora to debate, to discuss these pros. This is what we're doing at the moment, and to seek and to manage this legal acknowledgement.
Thank you, José. Muchas gracias. I would like to ask the next question to Matilda. And you mentioned that there are lots of dialogues and initiatives going on between the Sámi people and the Swedish government. But are they actually really focusing on integrating indigenous knowledge in forest policies, in the safeguarding of biodiversity and ecosystem services? Or how do you see that? And what is happening at the Swedish level here?
Yeah, there are some initiatives or also some work that's been ongoing for quite a few years on the use and application of traditional knowledge in management. That has been mainly regarding large carnivores and predators. So in Sweden, the populations of wolves and wolverines and bears and so on has been the management on these fields has been then trying to use indigenous knowledge in order to see how we can best adapt and use different kind of management tools in a way that reindeer herding is not that not so many damages are caused to reindeer herding. But in terms of forestry policy, which I understand was the question here, yeah, unfortunately, there's not so much work between the government and the Sámi parliament in terms of developing policies. And that's where we hope now that this act on consultation that the government has proposed and that will be has been forwarded to the parliament. We're waiting for the parliament to make a decision on that proposed act. But there it will be a duty for government and government authorities such as the Skogsstyrelsen, which is the Swedish forestry agency, that they will consult the Sámi parliament or other Sámi representatives on matters affecting them, which I saw also earlier in the chat. And of course, we see here the interlinkages of protecting, for example, in this case, then Sámi reindeer herding, how it also goes hand in hand with protecting biodiversity in the forest. So here there are really joint interests that could be used in order to really strengthen and have a policy that respects biodiversity as well as and ecosystem services and the Sámi land use and Sámi rights to their livelihoods.
Thank you. I don't know if we don't have much time, but wanted to have one last question to both of you. And I think it goes a bit in line with what you said before, the right to consultation or the right to consent, which are two different things actually. And also José mentioned the need and the obligation to actually be able to consent. And then if you, and that's for you, Matilda, and for José, what kind of recommendations would you directly give to policy or conservation programs, organizations who work with biodiversity conservation, to how best include human rights approaches, how best to ensure that rights of indigenous or local communities and traditional knowledges and the use of resources are actually taken into account and respected in any kind of like future policies or programs?
Do you want to
Muchas
start,
gracias.
José?
Sí, comenzar.
Great, I will start. With regards to the prior consultation, the Inter-American Court is very clear, and we need to come up with a legislation that ensures the participation of indigenous peoples in order to, on the one hand, to be consulted, not just to be made aware, but to reach consensus, to give consent and to respect the sovereign decision from our free determination as original peoples to decide. That is crucial. But also, on the other hand, in the name of democracy and of development, we're always being imposed things on us because they see themselves as the majority and the majority rules. But things are not like that. I believe that as original peoples, we have the same right to conserve and defend our environment because we're connected to it. We live, we coexist with the environment, not just as a beautiful landscape, but we coexist with other beings, invisible beings, other beings that are the ones that truly regulate and protect biodiversity. So we need to make sure that our fundamental human rights are protected. Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, I would see this from like in two steps. So the first step being then to really understand what are the rights, what are the content of these rights, and I think there's a lot of information also from UN mechanisms on the rights of indigenous peoples that are very helpful here in the understanding of both the aspects of consultation, but also on consent or free, prior, and informed consent. So that would be the first step. And then the second step is then to understand what these rights mean in practice for those concerned. And that means then actually then sitting down and listening to and hearing from the indigenous peoples in this case then affected, and then asking what their solutions and preferred ways forward would be, and then to develop policies or strategies or tools and solutions, management plans, whatever it might be, then jointly. So that would be to first get your knowledge, and then to hear actually from those who know how they are affected, how then these issues best be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you both so much, Matilda and José. I'm going to hand over the microphone again to Stephen. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We are so grateful to hear from your experiences, knowledges, and situations. And unfortunately, we have to move on because we have two more fantastic speakers to introduce you to. It's my great privilege to introduce Milka Chepkorir and Juana Esquivel. Milka Chepkorir is the coordinator of Defending Territories of Life at the ICCA Consortium and a member of the Sengwa Indigenous peoples of Cherang'any Hills in Kenya. Juana Esquivel is an Honduran defender of human rights and of natural and common resources. She is a founding partner and current director of the San Alonso Rodriguez Foundation. So we'll stay with the same format as we had before. We will begin with Milka. And again, please get your questions ready in the chat. We've heard such great questions so far, so keep them coming in whichever language you feel comfortable, and we'll make sure they get translated. So Milka, when you're ready, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I will share just experiences from my work as the coordinator of Defending Territories of Life at the ICCA Consortium, mainly because of a fund that we are managing together with the IPLC, Natural Justice, Kenya and South Africa. We're also managing it in relation with some support from The Voice in terms of financial resources. And this is a fund that is for African defenders to seek support, financial support whenever there is crisis. But these are environmental and human rights defenders. The trends in the very recent past has been so high, especially in Uganda and DRC, if I can't forget, mainly because of the urge and the role of communities to want to defend their territories and defend their resources in these forests, from logging, mining, and other forms of infrastructure, particularly in Uganda, is because of a loss of resources to a pipeline company that is crossing all the way through the East African countries. And what's happening is that defenders are being attacked, primarily to be harassed and be silenced from defending the conservation of their biodiversity and the rich resources within their lands. That shows that the push against the role and the agency of local indigenous people and local communities to conserve biodiversity is being fought against by governments and businesses, being the two main reasons for the insecurities of defenders. And in as much as we offer support to these defenders, it's just for a short while. And there's kind of an assumption that the savior to these defenders, or the savior to us changing the way we perceive human rights-based approach and biodiversity conservation, comes from some global level somewhere. you know, and that governments in the country, especially in the global south, are waiting for whoever has to bring that approach to them. Unfortunately, I will associate this to colonization of conservation, you know. The fact that what was implanted in African and Asian countries and Latin American countries is fortress conservation paradigm that assumed that conservation will only happen when people are not living within their territories. Sorry. And then now the same people, the Westerners and the Europeans, who brought the fortress conservation wants to now bring the human rights-based approach, assuming that all countries and all communities already adopted the fortress conservation. So the governments in the South are still, you know, fighting against something that they think is foreign, the human rights-based approach to biodiversity, because already the people who introduced them to fortress conservation already made them believe that that was the way to conserve. But what is the reality with indigenous people and local communities is that how we live with our land, the Causac-Sacha in Ecuador with the Sarayaku and ourselves, the Senguer and the Ogiek and many other forest communities, is that we relate with the forest and the trees and the resources just like we would relate with any other human being within, because we have the respect in that level. And I think to us, that is what human rights-based approach is. You know, how do we relate with what is giving us life? What is giving us our you know, food and clean water and clean air every day. So the construction of making it look like it has to come from outside again to communities is even causing more damage to communities. It is what is causing defenders to be attacked and killed, because then I'll tell you practically that the government of Kenya says that, you know, this is an idea from the whites, forgetting that the colonial way of creation of protected areas was first a white's idea that really delinked indigenous people from their, you know, the intimacy with their lands, the intimacy with their resources. We have other examples of communities that we are working in collaboration with as a consortium, like the Kochi in India, who have recently, although not officially, have managed to tame the proposals by the government to practice mining in their territories. Very rich biodiversity areas, forests that they have conserved for years, forests that have been able to house and provide shelter for community members during COVID, you know, because then it provides the very humble environment for communities to live in. We have communities in Nigeria, the Ecuador community, who are protecting their forest against logging, which is also being pushed by the government of Nigeria. We also have the Pueblo Shuar Arutam people in Ecuador, I think, who are also defending their territories from mining activities. So looking at all this, the power that is coming against environmental and human rights defenders is mainly from the economic you know, perspectives and actions that are taken by governments and propelled by mining or even other investment opportunities towards indigenous people's territories, disregarding their very fundamental role in their existence in these rich biodiversity areas and their role in keeping this resource until now. We have a very strong community elder in my community. I come from a forest indigenous community that says, it is not me in the forest, it is the forest on my land. And me and the forest are brothers. So that is what human rights-based approach to conservation of biodiversity is, making the relationship between these two. And sometimes these elders ask themselves, will it help us if we clear all this forest and all this biodiversity thing that the government want to kick us out of the land to conserve? or is the idea of protecting these areas an idea to just keep communities away and make them, you know, an exclusion of what it is to have been created and be put to be part of our ancestral territories? Yeah, and all those really disturb communities. Unfortunately, most of these discussions on conservation of biodiversity, conservation of forest, every recommendations from COP and every other international platform are all done at very levels where participation using languages that we imagine that when bringing them down to the people, that governments will be responsible to tell the people. Of course they won't. They want us to continue not knowing our rights so that they can continue taking advantage of us, which is why
time is running to the end. So it's good if you can round off, but it's super interesting, Milka. So take 1 minute more. Yes.
Okay, sure. So I was just bringing out the idea of you know, what is at the global level and what is at the local level. There is a huge space in between. There is a lot of assumptions that we are imagining that what we are discussing and deciding at the global level will reflect what is at the local level, when the first you know, mode of conservation, which is fortress conservation, has already been planted in governments' minds and hasn't been plucked out yet. So it's kind of forcing two things that fight against each other. And because the governments and the ideas are not linking, it is us indigenous communities that suffer, because then we are being evicted in the name of conservation. I think that is what I would want to say for now, and I'd welcome questions when that time comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so much for us to sit with and digest in what you said there. So we have to move on to Juana first of all, but we'll come back to questions to you both afterwards. So Juana Esquivel, are you there? Great, thank you. Over to you.
Buenos días. Buenos días y muchas
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the colleagues that have shared their experiences and their opinions with us. I believe that it is important to begin my presentation by saying how it has been brought to the surface, the contraposition of two different ways of life. On the one hand, we have the model proposed by the state, which is based in a capitalist model of extraction activities and the exploitation of the nature and natural resources. So we have this on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have all of this that has been mentioned by the other speakers that has a lot to do with the policies of life and the vision of the indigenous peoples with regard to their harmonic relationship with nature that is well lived and is based in a well living principle and coexisting. And this coexistence requires seeing nature as your sister, as your brother, as it was mentioned before. So these two opposing viewpoints make it difficult to see a harmonious public policy based on human rights with regards to a predatory economic model like the one we're experiencing in our communities and territories with extractive projects, hydroelectricity production, mining projects, all these projects that are depriving us from our land. So these two viewpoints, opposing viewpoints, and the fact that the states are not assuming the responsibility when it comes to protecting human rights, protecting the environment, protecting life, and establishing policies that will benefit the majority of the population. And this leads to a troublesome situation for the defenders of territories. And this is why we're facing serious human rights issues in our territories, because our communities know historically how to take care, how to cohabit with nature. We have the wisdom that allows us to be committed to life, because to us, biodiversity, nature, is not a means of life, is life itself. So it's not a livelihood, it's life. So our action is the only option. And this puts defenders on the first line, exposed to attacks from the big companies and the states themselves, who, rather than standing behind these policies that will protect the defenders, that will then protect the life of the communities and indigenous peoples, they decide to evict us and displace us from our territories that we are trying to defend. And then this makes it very clear that there are still many, many challenges that we face in order to these public policies based on human rights, and to bring them into practice to the benefit of the indigenous peoples and local communities. These opposing interests is what leaves us exposed to risks. And today, in our territories, defending the natural resources is one of the most risky things we can do. To defend nature, the resources, exposes us to a huge amount of risks and leaves us vulnerable because of these criminalization patterns that we have witnessed over the last years, such as forcibly displacing us, criminalizing us. Here in Honduras, today, there's a new case being brought to trial with 8 defenders of a river who are being criminalized for defending the river that supplies the community with water in a national park. So this lack of linkage between these interests and seeing as isolated things the human rights, as it was said before, human rights are key and they're interlinked. The human right to a healthy environment, to water, to clean air, to life. And this is what leads to this highly risky situation for the defenders in the communities that face a high level of vulnerability to imprisonment. And as my colleagues mentioned, there is no consultation, there is no prior consultation, and there's no means of access to consent or not to any projects in their territories.
1 minute.
And this lack of true public policies in our territories is what has kept us in this dire situation for defenders who which has a huge social impact in our lives. It breaks our communities. It leads to a lack of harmony in our communities, which is not the result of something we have done. It is the result of the presence of these extractive industries in our territories and the lack of the real public policies that are based on human rights. So the big challenge for us is this: if we had these public policies, we wouldn't be evicted from our land. We wouldn't be incarcerated. We wouldn't be murdered for trying to defend nature and natural resources. And the defenders wouldn't be in the conditions that we're living today that result from these actions I have mentioned. I then believe that there are many challenges ahead for these international policies, and these policies that we all know of. We're still not able to find a way for these policies to be real in our countries. The speaker who spoke before me has said that the policies come from the top down, and these policies are not taking into account what it means for an indigenous communities, for a pastoral community, for local communities, what really the natural resources are, which for us can be summarized in one word, and this is life. Is life what we're defending, and it is life the priority in our territories. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time.
Yeah, time is up.
Vaya, gracias.
Okay, I'll leave it here. Thank you. I think I've concluded my session. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again for all those rich insights, and that was really powerful, and we get a strong sense of the challenges that communities are facing from you. So I pass to Anna now in the interest of time for some questions. Thank you so much. And Milka, are you there? Do you want to come back in?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you, Milka, and thank you, Joanna. So first I would like to ask the question to Milka. I'll try to combine two. You mentioned a bit of the huge gap in space between local to global. And one of the questions, like the difference between the global discourse and the local reality. So there's a comment that says like it seems that it's needed like a deeper vision on political and institutional change that actually enables people to exert and exercise their right. So, but also combined with another question, so, like what are your key demands for civil society, NGOs, international organizations who work on international policy implementation and with national also decision maker? How can this local reality really reflect on a global level? Thank you.
Sorry, I lost you many of the times when you're speaking, so I was still going through the questions on the chat, but some of them I responded on the chat. So maybe if you can read one again, because you were really breaking.
Yeah, so it's more of you mentioned about the gaps in between local to global. The reflect the global discourse and the local realities are not combined. There is a gap in between. So what are, for instance, the key demands for international organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs who work on international policy implementation with national decision makers? Like, how can you have this ground really reflected also on the global? How can we reduce those gaps? I think we lost Milka.
Milka writes that she has a bad connection, so maybe we can go to Juana.
Yeah, we can go to one of the, she actually mentioned a little bit about it, and I can rephrase the question, and you can also try, you also mentioned about this gaps and this, the ground is not really reflected on globally, but also nationally. How can these gaps and the different actors, for instance, involved here can really support this, reduce this gap between the local, the ground, the realities, and the global discussions as well?
Mira que es una condición de doble.
It is really a sort of a double dimension or double faceted approach. I believe there had been some experiences with Indigenous people. I'm going to speak specifically from the Honduran experience, where there had been some policies of consultation, but they had been encouraged from top down. I believe there are some consultation mechanisms within the communities which are historic communities which had been here forever. And this wisdom on how the communities had made the self-management of the territories and this relationship with nature, this should be the first starting point. For me, that is the policy of life I was mentioning before, within the knowledge and the wisdom of peoples and communities. So therefore, it would have to be a policy or a proposal of policies which starts from the thinking and the feeling of the peoples to care for nature, to preserve nature. And clearly, within the national framework and an international framework, which will allow us to really have these activities of the guarantee to the right to nature and these preservation activities, the right to have a healthy environment, the right to water, and all the different related rights to nature.
Thank you, Juana. I don't know if we have Milka back, but I would like to make a question that it complements what you have started saying, and also if Milka can listen and can answer as well, would be very nice. So maybe think about what are the recommendations that you would give, like to policy, but also programs, that how to best ensure the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, human rights, environmental defenders are ensured in policy, but also are ensured like in programs implemented. So it's a question for both of you. Juana, you can start perhaps.
Bueno, las políticas tienen...
The policies should have some criteria, but I believe they have to be adaptable. And in this particular case, it has to be adaptable to the reality of peoples and communities. Policies should be accepted. They should be accepted by those people who are more vulnerable or who are in a higher vulnerability conditions with regards to other sectors of population. And the policies also should be available to be put into practice. I mean, if there's a policy which is not put into practice into the territory, quite the contrary, when we implement policies which are against or different to those policies, I mean, there is a lack of harmony between the legal aspect, the social aspect, and the environmental aspect. So this lack of harmony among the policies and between the different legislations, on the one hand, we want to promote the investment, the development, the capital in the territories, but on the other hand, we want to preserve the environment. And these two things, it is difficult to try to reconcile them. It is really hard to put them together. And this happens in the territory. So this violation to this right of the consent, I mean, the consent is a key factor that should be guaranteed in the policies, because if this process of consultation and consent could be implemented from the communities, I mean, we could save so many conflicts, the ones we are facing at the moment in our territories. So I believe a starting point will be the transparency, the accountability, and the participation, the engagement, and the participation, the right to consultation, the free, previous, and informed consent, and to guarantee that we can really have a process by which the communities can consent these models of progress, of development that they want to impose in their territories, because the communities themselves, they have their own lifestyles, their own models of life, their own policies for life. So I believe it is important to retake and to go back to this word which has been said, how to guarantee the consent of communities
Juana?
for these processes and this process of participation, of
Juana, can we
engagement,
start wrapping?
which can really guarantee that politics could be directed to protect life.
Thank you very much, Juana. I would like, we are short on time, but I would like to hear from Milka. Milka, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm not sure I'll respond to all the questions on the chat because very many of them were directed to me, but I will put my email address on the chat for people to seek answers to their questions directly, and I will be there to respond. But one very striking question for me is the global and the local discourse and discussion when it comes to conservation, human rights, and indigenous people's rights. It is definitely a disturbing issue, and to me it is a problem because we try to make it look like at the global level human rights or the rights to biodiversity feels this much of a privilege, and at a local level then it is of less privilege, and therefore governments and investors and practitioners of conservation can treat it as they wish. But the thing is about the discussion and policy. Why would we want to make it look like it's very perfect on paper at the global level and disregard the fact that a lot of violations are happening at the at the international level, making it look very good, and that at the local level, forgetting that there are previous global processes that have led to sufferings of indigenous and local communities in their territories. So I think there's still a lot of things to reflect on, in as much as linking the two issues in whichever the aspect of global discussion you want to look at. And Jessica just asked a question about the use of the word damage and loss. I don't really think using HRBA as a way will, as a terminology or as a campaign or whatever it is, will help address this. Because the people who have really been behind climate change and the destruction of the environment is not the local communities. It's been big investors and huge companies and people with big influences in the north and some of them in the south that have been doing this. So them being in the tables to discuss about this and still want it to look like HRBA is the way to go, while they are the same people who are mandated to implement, then it beats logic. They say you cannot give the violator of the right the power to implement the right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I will have to cut you short, but we can continue answering the question in the chat, and people can still posting. And I'm sorry because we're short of time. Can you just wrap up your thoughts?
Yeah, just a final thought is for us to be aware that when we are talking about issues at the COP, at whatever the international level and global level is, it doesn't really reflect what happens in the local community level. And it is time to be realistic with that, whether you are a funding organization, an advocacy organization, be realistic to the effects of colonial mechanisms and paradigms that have been used toward conservation, and then help from that perspective than going to a global level place and think that we can bring governments to book by using decisions that have been made at a very global, at a very high level of decision making. In the first place, they won't even rhyme with most of the indigenous people and local communities' way of life. And very final one to say is that the way indigenous people and local communities live in their territories is what human rights-based approach is. Then let's all start from there.
Thank
you so much. Thank you so much, Milka and Juana. Stephen and Maria?
Yes, I will jump in now. Thank you so much, all the great and inspiring speakers. I really, really wish that we had more time to listen to your insights. Thank you so much. You can continue also discussions in the chat, and we will really try to also capture what your recommendations and insights after this event. So now we will turn to a Mentimeter and a kind of a platform for participants, and then we will have a short concluding remark by Claudia, who will also try to wrap these levels together. So during this platform, I mean, we have one Mentimeter question prepared, but as we have discussed, you're free to answer this question: what needs to happen for a human rights-based approach to be applied in conservation policy and practice? But you can also, if you feel that it's more relevant, as based on our discussions, sort of answer what needs to change and at what level, as Milka brought up these big differences between the global and the local realities. So you can go to Menti via the link and the codes that you have in the chat. But we would also like to hear very short, we will take in a few perspectives. If any one of the participants have something short that they would like to share on this, perhaps you have a strong message on what needs to change at a certain level, or experience of this kind of positive change that you can share, that others can learn and get inspired by. So if you have anything brief that you want to voice and share, please write your name in the chat, and we will pick you up there. And it can also be if any of the previous speakers want to comment on this, but we will first try to see if there's anyone among the participants. We have so many different local realities represented here, and would like to hear more voices on this issue. So if you have any either strong points on what you feel needs to change, recommendations going forward to policy programs, you're welcome to write in the chat, or you can also raise your hand if there is anything you would like to come in and share. While doing that, you can also continue to write in the Mentimeter in all 3 languages. But I know that there are many here working on policy and programs. Maybe that you also want to share if there was some lesson from this event, the discussions that you will bring with you, if you don't feel that you have something from your context that you want to share. So any key insights that you will take home can also be shared. Maybe all are melting the impressions. Maybe anyone in the organizing team have any idea, or if you want to come in and share anything that you will take with you from the discussions, or any change needed that you picked up. We can see there's plenty coming in here via the Mentimeter as well. And one thing we will do after this, as I said, we will try to compile recommendations based on this exchange to policy and programs. So your recommendations that you are putting in via the Mentimeter will be used, and you can also connect with us after if you have more references, more cases you want to share, and if you're interested to sort of get engaged in writing up recommendations that we can also help to promote ahead of this second part of COP15 or other processes that it might be relevant to. But I don't see any hands, or I don't see that anyone want to come in. Is that right? Jessica, you don't see anyone writing in Spanish or Portuguese either that they want to voice anything?
No,
yes.
not yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then I think we can keep this Menti open, so keep the recommendations going, and then I will hand back to Stephen, who will then introduce Claudia and the closing while this Menti can be up in the background.
Fantastic, thank you, Maria, and thank you all for staying with us through this afternoon. Well, it's afternoon, we're in Sweden at least, and we're so grateful to everything that we've heard. And if you're anything like me, then there's just a lot to really sit with and digest, and there's, you know, some really powerful points that have been made that can't be kind of necessarily responded to instantaneously, but rather we need to really yeah, to offer some concluding reflections then, what I want to do is to invite Claudia Ituarte-Lima for that. And Claudia is a senior researcher at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And so Claudia, are you with us?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we see that we are in a triple global crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and that combined with the pandemic. And one of the questions that arises is, in a world where socio-ecological crises are all too prevalent, do we need a broader human rights frame in which empathy, hope can also have an equally prevalent place in the role of legal innovations in here? So the insightful and powerful presentations that we have had give us a lot of food for thought for this. And I would just like to highlight two assumptions that have been put forward during our dialogue, and that I have also been experiencing during my work in this area of human rights and biodiversity. The first assumption that limits this progressive narrative, it does many still see women, indigenous people, local communities, children as passive victims of environmental degradation. It has been very clear through the presentations that although people may be vulnerable, this does not equate with being passive victims. They are indeed many of these people in vulnerable situations, such as environmental human rights defenders, triggering transformative change. This transformative change that this has been put forward as a need by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, put forward by the Sustainable Development Goals. We have been hearing, as Joan Carling highlighted, that indigenous people and local communities are bringing these solutions. We heard from, for instance, José Gualinga, these proposals of law for this living forest, or the proposals also by Matilda, Månsson, in terms of the Sámi parliament and how they bringing their proposals forward. So here we see that, again, there are certain advances at the global level that in some way connect, diverge or not with this. And we see that, for instance, the Cancun Declaration on mainstream biodiversity in sectors and cross-sectorally explicitly referred to human rights. We have the Gender Action Plan in the context of the Convention of Biological Diversity. while these advances are important, it is only when states start to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, specifically the right to a healthy environment, that we will be truly in the path for environmental justice. And here, the second assumption that I would like to highlight that again limits the way we can achieve this realization of the right to a healthy environment is this assumption that international law will trickle down into national and local realities directly. So this idea of a ground-up approach that we heard here that is needed. So I think giving just two examples, and that David Boyd and Soo-Young also highlighted, was the resolution, Human Rights Council resolution on the right to a healthy environment. So while this resolution was adopted and negotiated by states, it was vital civil society organizations, grassroots communities, women organizations, more than 1,300 organizations called for this recognition. Another example, the Escazú Agreement on Information, Participation, Access to Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, was the first treaty explicitly recognizing the rights of environmental defenders. And again, here, while it's an international treaty adopted by state institutions, civil society had a key role in implementation and will have a key role in also monitoring the results. And here what Milka and Chepkorir and Juan Esquivel highlighted also provide us really with powerful ideas of how to respect what is giving us life. And I would like to conclude by saying that integrating the human rights, specifically the right to a healthy environment, in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework can be championed by all these states that already champion this recognition of the right to a healthy environment at the Human Rights Council, but also by civil society, indigenous people, and local communities. So not to only be at the periphery, but also at the core of this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And that integrating human rights in the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, it is really a key opportunity for bringing right holders and duty bearers together in opening and broadening this frame in which collective action, hope to safeguard the foundations of life, leaving no one behind, is key. And to end, I would just like to remind some words from Wangari Maathai, who, as you know, is the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And she said, "We are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds, and in the process, heal our own. This will happen if we see the need to revive our sense of belonging to a larger family of life." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was really poignant way to start to close our event today. And it was also a great synthesis of what we've heard so far as well, as much as can be done, of course, given the richness of all the contributions we've heard this afternoon. So I'll hand back over to Maria now in order to start to close the event. And
yes,
Maria?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
So I don't know how to close such a rich event. There's so much we would like to continue to discuss. I hope you also, you can maybe ask a few questions to Claudia in the chat if you will be there, or otherwise maybe you can add your contact as well. Thank you for bridging the different speakers and levels in a very good way. It's very difficult to wrap up, and of course look, there's great differences between different local realities and then bridging and the local level. So I would like to thank all that has been involved here as speakers and helping out in different ways to make this exchange possible. With a few remaining minutes, I would like to inform you about a few things following up from this event. There will be a recording from this event that we will share to all who signed up when it's available. And we will try to do our best to compile recommendations shared by speakers and through the Mentimeter from participants. And if you're also interested to be part of this, maybe a writing up process, we haven't decided exactly how and what we will write, but there's been so much rich shared here that we think a broader audience should take part of. So you can connect with us, organizers, for that. Also, if you have other ideas on how to follow up the themes that have been discussed, you're welcome to connect. So with that, I would like to also bring in, if there are any more ideas from others in the team who have helped out, if you want to share any concluding thoughts or thanks as well.
Hi. So I just would like to thank everyone, the participants and also the team, and to thank everyone for the participation and the importance of continue the discussion, specifically of key points on human rights and biodiversity, and also this gap that was mentioned several times between discourse, the global policy, and the ground. I would like just to say thank you very much again, and let's continue the discussion because it's very timely for us.
Yes, thank you so much. If there are any other of the speakers with a few remaining minutes or that want to share any final thought on ways forward, that what we could do together, you're welcome. Any of the organizers or speakers, you can use voice.
I'll just say a couple of points. One is how important it is that we use our voices in the spaces we occupy to amplify what we've heard today, right? So we were at times about 200 people, and we can carry these points and insights, contributions and situations to many different spaces, including in the arena of biodiversity stewardship and elsewhere. But that's really important that we take on those roles as well. And and also just to encourage you to sit again with the recording once we've shared it, to go back over what we heard today, because as we've already heard, there was just so much richness and diversity in terms of perspectives, and that it's really worth just going back over, in my opinion at least. And thanks again for everyone for contributing, for your questions, and just the level of engagement was really just really great to see. So thank you so much.
Finally, I can also mention that my colleague Magdalena, she just put a survey in the chat. The questions are in English, but I'm sorry for that. We will handle trilingual events better next time, but it will be great in any way to get feedback on this event, what we can improve, and how we can continue to collaborate ahead around these themes. So with that, I want to thank all again for your contributions today. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. And with the final closing minutes, if there's anyone who want to just come in and voice something. The translation is on for a few minutes, but then we will end. So this is. We get a lot of comments in the chat also that it has been good learning.
Gracias. Hasta pronto.
Bye.
Gracias.
Gracias, obrigado. Thank you. Tack.
Thank you, obrigado.